And I'm hoping that we can create these full stack companies where from inception of the molecule design to the GMP to the patient stratification and enrollment could all be done in one company. And by optimizing each one of that stage, we can get to maybe being able to get to market in less than 10 years and have a longer patent life on that. But most importantly, actually change the unit economics of these therapeutics so that people could actually get true access to it.
Hi, my name is Mika Newton. I'm the host of AI and Healthcare. I am today with a great friend and mentor of mine, Krish Ramadurai, and I'm super excited to be talking with him. He has been on the board of my company, AIX before. He's now an investor at AIX Ventures, and we're going to hear a lot about what's hot and not in AI and healthcare. Hey, Krish, great to have you on the show.
Super excited to be here, Mika. Happy Friday, happy Valentine's Day, and excited to nerd out on the future of healthcare with you.
That's awesome. You can be my Valentine's today. That's perfect. So let's start with I think a question I hear a lot because AI has a lot of hype behind it. But what in healthcare AI is actually real today versus what's really kind of overhyped noise? Can you help us start to kind of understand, at least from your perspective, of what's hot and what's not? Question.
Sure, 100%. I think the signal to noise ratio in the AI space has been increasingly robust. I think a lot of the times when I talk to founders, they forget that healthcare vertical integration is insanely difficult. And unfortunately, you need to have a tactical operator that has domain expertise and understands the business development cycles of those areas, because you can have a beautiful algorithm and a case study behind it. But as you know very well, the BD cycles and clinical engagement, it's a long tail, and defining what the use cases are and the tangible value of the AI algorithms and then the frictionless integration. It's a very heavy lift. So I think in the AI space, what we've seen is, a lot of great AI expertise, but misaligned with market adoption and traction and actual true integration in the field. I see a lot of beautiful Gen AI architectures that are trying to be layered onto Windows 96 healthcare IT tech stacks. And everybody in healthcare wants to find the tangible use case for AI integration. But the problem is that either you have these overly complex UIs and they have a misconnect with the technical expertise that's required, or the tech stacks just don't vibe with each other. And when you try to actually integrate the solution into the architecture, and it takes more than 8 weeks to actually get somebody to learn how to use it, you kind of lose all the value inherent with it. So I think in the space these days, we've shown that generative AI architecture has been really great for clinical workflow automation solutions and a lot of the very low-hanging fruit, right? I think everybody's trying to eat the entire loaf of bread instead of just slicing it up into these unique subdomains. So, you've got companies that we've backed like Ambience Healthcare and a lot of the Scribe-esque companies that showed hey, LLM architectures are really great for text-based architectures and analysis, which is awesome. And it ends up being a force multiplier for them. But unfortunately, there are a lot of companies that, try to go after imaging analysis and a lot more of the complex stuff that oftentimes people forget that you need to have a physician in the loop, and it's not going to replace them. And I think on the regulatory context, as you know very well, the FDA requires a human in the loop feedback. So I think when it comes to dictation and EHR integration and text-based extraction, it's fantastic, right? NLP shines very well, medical affairs analytics, other things. But when it comes to the more complex areas where technical domain expertise is required and a physician has to be in the loop, I think that's where people misread the situation and understanding that AI doctors are not replacing physicians. You need to have real-world clinical validation for autonomous decision-making, right? AI can assist, but it's not replacing human physician oversight. And I've seen so many founders being like, hey, we have an AI radiologist. I was like, great, we still need an actual radiologist. And of course, when it comes to image analysis and stuff like that, generative AI and all those architectures are great at 2D dimensional analysis, but we have to extrapolate for that Z-axis. So I think when I talk to a lot of the founders in the space, you really need to make sure that like companies like Rad AI and CareSyntax and everything I've backed all had physicians that understood how to be a KOL for that product and integrate it through the channel partners. And then it met that really robust AI architecture. And then they knew how to create a frictionless UI that could make it easier for the provider to actually want to use it. And then most importantly, like, they're in that middle of that Bermuda Triangle of the patients, payers, and providers. How do you optimize all three in a sequential, stepwise function, which is very difficult to do because oftentimes you see a AI company that's focused in one of those buckets but doesn't know how to cover the spread. So that's a lot of stuff. But the AI hype stuff, I think, was just mainly around, like, AI is not replacing physicians anytime soon, but it is optimizing them. And what I think of it as these co-pilots as maximum value add and just a kind of a Batman belt-esque tooling agent to maximize, output of physicians. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, Chris, it's really interesting. There's a couple of things that I heard in what you were talking about that really resonate with me. Number one is this idea that you have to have the domain expertise, right? I think, having worked in life sciences and then healthcare for a long time now, I think there's a lot of technical folks who come in with incredible technical backgrounds and really understand the data science architecture. They just don't understand, to your point, the actual reality of being in the healthcare landscape with the legacy systems. And, cloud computing is even a new thing still in many healthcare environments. So I think it's just a reality check, and having the expert understanding of what's really done in a healthcare scenario is also really important. One of the things I've talked about with others kind of on this hype speed, and I think you started touching on this when you said you have to have a human in the loop. And I think about this even from the work we've done at Xcheers, what I talk about with my own team here is it doesn't really help to have like a 50% solution, right? If you solve half the problem and you leave your users still solving the other half of the problem, and therefore they have the same number of people or the same throughput cycle as they did before, even if some of it is like perceptually easier, you still haven't solved the problem. So, you kind of get to this hard question of like, what is the actual business model? What is the cost savings? Or, money has to go up or costs need to go down, right? Revenue or costs. And how do you do that? Do you see that in companies when they come to you? Are they able to articulate these business model parameters to you in a way that's realistic?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think this is the hardest part because I see so many companies that are in what I call pilot purgatory, where it's great to have that initial 250K engagement. But then when you look at the scalability coefficient into those real enterprise contracts, it's a massive valley of death, I find, because, every provider I talk to says, yeah, we have a zillion pilots right now. And then I'm like, name me the top 3 companies you're engaging with. And they're like, honestly, I got to go back and get back to you. And then that's telling me like, oh, there's a lot of vitamin solutions out there, but nobody was able to extrapolate quantitatively the time cost savings or the margin enhancement behind it, which means that, when you're trying to pitch this to hospital admin, and especially in PE oriented healthcare systems, like, you need to have those quantitative aspects, right? And that's what gets you jumping the gate from the pilot to the large scale enterprise contracts that I'm more interested in, because that means that they're actually taking you seriously. And what's nice is that, as you know, the churn rate is extremely low, right? The barrier to entry is massive to get those contracts, but it's endogenous to the business in itself that's kind of the self-selecting gradient. So a lot of the times the AI companies I find that are automating solutions from A to B, but as you know, the enterprise value maximization is automating A to Z. And you have to have a logical stepwise function on that, where you have a beachhead defined case study that shows an optimization gradient of better, faster, cheaper, robustly. And then you can take that case study and bring it to multiple different domains as a land and expand approach. But as you know, like, getting granular and contextually defining the utility maximization and then the frictionless integration and the UI of it, oftentimes founders don't really explain that very well. Like, we get dabbling into the architecture and everything, which is great, but like, as you know, IP and AI is extremely difficult to get, right? Like, and what's stopping a lot of these co-pilot companies, like, I can go on GitHub and rip the back end code off a lot of the companies very quickly, right? And so that's telling me like, okay, if we can't get it granular on the IP for the algorithm, then it has to be the go-to-market, right? That's the only other thing. And a lot of the companies, majority of them, fail to actually define that use case. And when I back channel to the partners and stuff like that and the customers and I talk to them, if they're not telling me like I want this tomorrow, then it's just being like, okay, it's just another optimization play that really isn't going to be long tail on enterprise value creation for anybody. So
It reminds me, there's another discussion I've been having a lot about the commodification, right, of AI. So when I think about like deepthink or any of these things that have come out, I know there's a lot of hype. Again, it's AI, so there's like a lot of hype and money moving around. But I know from our own exploration and just from talking to others, the actual AI tech is really good and it's getting better really fast, like really fast. And so I really, in that world, start to view it as a commodity to some extent. There's still a massive amount of investment that needs to happen to move it forward. But it seems to me that a lot of the value creation is really going to be in the application layer, right? And in really driving it down to the end. So can you think of any example of just other companies that are out there or companies from your portfolio you think have kind of figured that magic? You were talking about the Bermuda Triangle out, where they're like, hey, we're really going to solve this problem. And we already know how to do it. And it's clear it has to be solved, right? And so you can have a lot of confidence in what they're going after.
sure, absolutely. I think at the end of the day, the biggest winners I backed in the AI healthcare space were able to get those proprietary data lakes that nobody else could get, and then couple that with the channel partner distribution. If you do those two things, like you're golden in this space. And everybody's using the same publicly sourced API data to build these models, right? And everybody knows that healthcare systems are sitting on an ungodly amount of unstructured, unlabeled data, as you totally know. And getting access to that data lake takes a long time to do that. Trusted relations and going through SOC 2 and HIPAA and all that fun stuff before you can even get there. And that's where I'm finding the really robustness of the defensibility when it comes to the tech being a winner. So I would say companies that I back like Rad AI and CareSyntax and all of Ambience and Ellipsis Health and a bunch of other companies really were able to build out that proprietary data lake through the healthcare systems that they partner with, and then optimizing. Like, I'll give a great example of CareSyntax, Bjorn von Siemens company. Surgery, as you know, is every hospital's baby. It's the highest profitable arm of it, and they won't let you touch that with a 10-foot pole unless you are extremely robust on how this is going to increase margins and reduce malpractice liability. And that was something where we had started off initially on like, okay, how do we optimize the surgical protocols, right? And instrumentation. Great, that's an A to B play. But how do we do A to Z on a digital surgery domain, right? Well, if we can optimize the efficiency of surgeons in the operating theater and have them make less mistakes, right, that's going to reduce malpractice liability. That's going to increase patient throughput. And then ultimately it's going to increase, bringing patients to and through the surgery centers to increase outflow. And so then the payers are billing more. You're getting less malpractice. The physicians are excited because they're making less errors. And then you're optimizing the throughput of surgical volume. So that took a long time. That took 8 years to get to that point, right? And you would think a lot of the AI founders we can compress that in only a couple of years. I was like, it doesn't work like that. These are trusted systems. And if you're working with large institutions, right, they're going to be heavily scrupulous on this. And it's a very tactical step-based function that takes, unfortunately, a lot of time. And then also you have to be cognizant of consolidation too, right? With the scribe space, it's become overly saturated. You're only going to have a handful of winners. You can't have multiple billion-dollar companies that are in that same bucket at the same time. You inevitably have to expand to all the other ologies. And in order to do that, you need to have a tactical Sherpa, I like to say, in each one of those distinct domains. And that's very difficult to do. And that's where you build that really robust enterprise value creation in downstream instead of just being a functional point solution. So, but in order to do that, I mean, you're talking about building the AI layer out, the BD domain, getting trusted channel partner syndication, providing those really robust case studies so that hospital admin can review that with a fine-tooth comb and understand immediately that the integration will not be a liability coefficient to, the operational domain of that healthcare system, and then showing that you can maximize enterprise value. Like, that's a lot of stuff you have to get right, and it doesn't just happen like over a couple years.
It's a lot of stuff. I know it's a lot of stuff. So let's switch gears a little bit here. Let's talk about what is AI-enabled, predictable, and engineerable biology. Talking a little bit more about the biological sciences.
Sure, absolutely. So, at AIX, I think it's been great, for me to lead the healthcare and life sciences practice here in ushering this new era of what we call predictable biology, where biotech doesn't need to be a wildcatting discipline where it's like drilling for oil. Now we can actually use all of this data to actually make informed decision outputs that can actually translate to better assets and development. And, the biggest thing is that everybody has thought that this AI for drug development discovery is this magic bullet, but unfortunately AI can't replace wet lab validation, right? You still need to have expertise to fine tune this. And the biggest thing that I've been focused on at AIX is building a world-class practice around how do we solve this translatability crisis in biotech, right? As you know, 95% of assets fail. The attrition rate is terrible. Everybody knows that we solved all the diseases in mice, and none of that translates to human biology. So how do we use human biology from the get-go so that when we come in with these beautiful designer assets that have been algorithmically generated, that they're going to perform extremely well and not just bomb out in clinical trials? And this has been something that, backing companies like In Silico Medicine and BitBio and a lot of those in vivo therapeutics, that we started with human data from the get-go. And this is what's separating the AI drugs that are performing extremely well in clinical trials versus the ones that have bombed out, because I see a lot of beautiful designer assets that unfortunately were trained off of the wrong data, and then they just flame out because of toxicity, or oftentimes the patient cohorts that are enrolled in these trials, if you develop these assets off of homogeneous data that are, white males ages 20 to 40, right, of a specific type of cohort, and then you have the recruiting profile of multiple different genders, ethnicities, ages, everything, that asset is already doomed to fail, right? But people will still be trying to do that. And I think the AI biotech stuff has done a pretty bad job in showing, how do we optimize and develop assets better and cheaper, right? We saw that with Recursion, right? But I think companies like In Silico Medicine, with their lead asset being in phase 3, the reason why that asset did so well is because we trained it off of patient responder data from the get-go, and it was beautifully heterogeneously defined. And that's what turned asset development into a predictive discipline, because I knew with the highest degree of certainty that those assets would perform extremely well because we had already used the cohort responder data that would be indicative of those trial enrollments, right? So, and that's what we've been looking to build here at AIX, of building those models of backing companies that have really robust data moats and data like from biopharma, but also that data is just unparalleled when it comes to diversity, so that we know that the next set of assets we're building with the highest degree of certainty will be ideally flipping that gradient on its head to a 95% success rate. So, but knowing that we still have to stick to the fundamentals and first principle basis of you have to get the biology correct, right? You can have a beautiful algorithm, but if the bio sucks, it doesn't really matter, right? So
awesome. So I want to unpack a couple of things you talked about. So this is something I've talked about for I don't know, since the beginning of my career, which is the fact that we don't really understand biology. We claim to think that we understand biology, but in reality, we understand a very, very small percentage of the actual systems biology that's taking place, specifically when you start thinking about a whole human body, the whole organism, what's really happening, right? And the complexity of that. And so is that something now where you think AI has gotten good enough, or machine learning models, right? Or are we actually starting to see returns from the system biology between just some kind of, I would see predictions in the biological model that happen at a mechanism level that don't really tell you anything about the organism, right? On its end. Is that stuff really coming into its own now?
Yeah, I think the holy grail of, AI-enabled life sciences is a digital twin of a cell, right? A virtual cell, and that we can understand these cellular dynamics, from that basis, right? And then ultimately scale that into that complex multi-organ system. And like you said, right, a lot of small molecule AI developers are focused on one mechanistic pathway. And as you know, human biology works in mysterious ways. Mother Nature does too. So oftentimes these models really suck at, predicting off-target effects, safety, and efficacy. And that's been kind of the first principle basis that we've been taking care of. Can we figure out 65% of phase 1 drugs fail because of toxicity, right? And oftentimes it's linked to mitochondrial toxicity, right? And that specific purview, how do we build, digital twins of cell-based mitochondria? And that was, the last investment I had done, Ignota Labs out of the University of Cambridge, figured out that by having the world's largest mitochondrial toxicity data set to extrapolate that and basically slingshot these distress assets in phase 1 back in the clinic just by tweaking the chemistry a little bit. And I think that's been really important of how do we bridge the gap from adaptive chemoinformatics, right? Like where we can take these drugs and retool them, because everybody's been focused on de novo asset development, which is awesome, right? But as you know, it costs a lot of money and it takes a lot of time. And there's so many low hanging fruit plays in biopharma of shelved assets that, pharma spent 30, 50 million bucks on. And just because the tox profile came back and they didn't know how to retweak the molecule, they just shelved it, right? And I've been telling a lot of the biotech founders these days, especially in the market situation that we're in, of just go after all these distressed assets and try to figure out if you can tweak the chemoinformatic profile of this, and then do a CODA partnership with them or in-license it, and then you're off to the races. You're a clinical stage company, as opposed to spending 5 to 7 years doing scratch de novo asset generation and then crossing your fingers. There's a lot of stuff like that. So we're seeing that happen where there's a lot of asset arbitrage these days. And I was like, this is something that AI is actually quite good at. LLMs can be very good at doing graph neural networks for toxicity prediction. And unfortunately, a lot of people just overlook that because it's probably not the sexiest thing, but only if you're a real, industry expert would you know of that specific type of problem and then connect the dots to, knowledge graphs would be an ideal solution for that. And that's where we're seeing that disconnect because, as you know, there's only 15, 20 tech bio firms in the United States. And oftentimes the founders are in this pickle because they're only there in the early stage, right? And then when you hit growth stage, you have to hit the fundamental benchmarks to be attractive for an OrbiMed or a Deerfield. And if you haven't shown that pipeline progression and only moved laterally on platform, you actually destroyed enterprise value across the board. And I think that's why you've seen all these AI discovery companies be in a midlife crisis right now, because all the growth stage people said, awesome, I can't underwrite your AI. I can only underwrite the drugs that came out. Show me where you're at. And if you're not IND or clinical facing right now, you're stuck in that purgatory where you're probably just going to run out of cash. And then somebody's just going to have to buy you in a distressed situation, or you just go to zero. So,
it's interesting. We started touching on a topic I've talked about with a bunch of people here, which kind of I think of drug repurposing or drug rescue, whatever. It's kind of the same thing, right? That distressed asset that you just described, and what do you do with it going forward? One of the other discussions we've had is that there is a huge amount of IP that's actually sitting on the shelf. So think of all of the data. And by the way, if you go look in the big biopharma companies, right, they have enormous data troves on some of these assets, most of it which has never seen the light of day, right? So have you seen anyone who's done a good job of maybe finding those and maybe unpack? Because part of it is, can I repurpose or rescue this drug? The other thing is, can I acquire its IP? Do I actually understand what I need to understand about it? Do I have some of the information about it? Is there really liquidity in that market now?
Yeah, it's kind of wild. You can buy distressed phase 1A, phase 1B assets for $60,000, $70,000, depending on the situation of the company, right? And as you know, everybody's been shopping around China these days. I think that one takes the playbook on that has to be pretty refined. But there's a lot of asset arbitrage opportunities if you have the unique market insight and ability to navigate it correctly, right? Because often understanding too, the limitations of your own tech architecture, right? It's great that asset might be available on the cheap, but if you don't know with the highest degree of certainty that the algorithm you develop could actually contextually refine that molecule to make it successful, then you're just manifesting another failure. So I think when it comes to small molecule drugs, that's been the best play to take, right? Because small molecules easy to tweak from a chemoinformatic perspective. But if you're talking about IO or the more complex biologics, that's kind of a crapshoot these days. I would like to get to the point where we could, sufficiently rescue failed biologics drugs, but given the complexities on the nature of it and GMP and everything, like it's a bit tough. But I think on the cell therapy side, the exciting thing that we've been, looking around is being able to actually program biology from inception correctly and define that software of life where we can differentiate cells in a controlled protocol fashion and repeatable. And that's what we did at BitBio. And I was, but doing it in a way that can actually increase enterprise value for everybody, but democratize access to these critical therapies, right? Like, there's no point in having another CAR T therapeutic that costs $3 million for a protocol because, as you know, like, what's the trickle down economics on that? None. Like, it's like, how are you going to see these breakthrough therapies, ideally sherped and escorted to low and middle income countries? They'll never see the light of day. And I think the thing is that we have to use AI to tweak the unit economics behind the CapEx and the development of these. So ideally, the next batch of cell therapies costs less than $100,000, right? But I'm hoping that we can create these full stack companies where from inception of the molecule design to the GMP to the patient stratification and enrollment could all be done in one company. And truly be full stack. And by optimizing each one of that stage, we can get to maybe being able to get to market in less than 10 years and have a longer patent life on that. But most importantly, actually change the unit economics of these therapeutics so that people could actually get true access to it. So
I couldn't agree more with you. I think there's some amazing technology that's coming down the pipeline, but we've got to be able to afford it, but we need to be able to deploy it, and we need to be able to that point, bring it to market fast enough to actually make it worth developing in the first place at all. So let's talk a little bit about AI native health tech and what's going on in that space, and what should the audience be paying attention? What are you paying attention to in AI native health tech?
Yeah, so I think in this space, the biggest thing that I've been trying to figure out is, okay, now that we've automated, a lot of people are doing workflows. How do we get into the more complicated aspects like diagnostics and image analysis and things like that? I just led a Series A for a company called AIX AI, which developed the first AI native oncology diagnostic for breast cancer, as you know. And what we liked is that it flipped the model of diagnostics on its head, where it doesn't need to be a one-shot pony, 100, 300 million exit. And most VCs are like, yeah, that's not going to be a fun returner. I don't want to do diagnostics or tools, but instead digitalizing a CLIA laboratory to where now we can have one company that has 10 diagnostic tests, which means we can stack the enterprise value creation for each one of those tests on top of each other. And then all of a sudden you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar exact sciences kind of playbook, but with margins that have been substantially optimized because we've been able to, automate all the wet lab architecture associated with typical diagnostics. And that's the approaches that I've been trying to look of. How do we flip the narrative on a lot of these market domains that have been typically overlooked because the enterprise value creation just wasn't there? And so the next batch of investments, we've been excited about doing 3D spatial imaging and digital pathology, right? And doing ultra high throughput analysis of that, and, being able to create these awesome foundation models for human biology that we can do image analysis correctly on a Z-dimensional framework, right? Because like radiology now, like everybody's been doing image analysis on a 2D scale, but oftentimes pathologies are overlooked because you don't have the third dimension added to it. So trying to figure that out of how do we automate these workflows so that radiologists don't miss elements in those screens and are be able to actually dictate those more hidden morphologies of cancer that might have not been eminent in the first screen. And then I think when it comes to the life sciences stuff as well, clinical indication selection is extremely important. I think a lot of the AI people forgot that you have to develop assets that pharma is actually interested in. And if you don't have that 2-year lead time and you build that direct candidate that's in an area that pharma is of interest and you get that misalignment, it sucks, right? Because some of the companies in 2021 that are coming out with direct candidates for solid tumor IO right now are all of a sudden, or AML, are all of a sudden being like, oh, wow, pharma does not care right now about those. And then like we just wasted the 2 years building this whole premise around the company of an area that's no longer of interest. So I think for the next set of allocations, we've been trying to focus on what are plays in immunology and precision oncology that are robust enough to be, best in class winners when it comes to therapeutic asset development in these areas. We're therapeutically agnostic, but ideally we want to, invest in these next batch of companies that have a fighter jet formation of clustered asset development programs that are in multiple high value domain areas, but also can leverage the architecture for orphan indications as well, because as you know, like it's always overlooked and nobody cares. But if you're able to maximize the enterprise value on the initial set of lead programs, you can oftentimes bring in the less attractive market sentiment assets, and I think the other areas like, AI clinical trials, right? Like, it's been interesting in that area because there's been so much noise and saturation when it comes to recruitment and everything. And the digital twinning stuff was cool in the beginning. I think the FDA said, we can't do that for patients yet because it's tough. I would love to see that because, as you know, for Alzheimer's and a lot of those trials, it's a huge pain in the butt to enroll. And if we can just do a digital twin of a patient and systematically enroll them across the board, it'll be a game changer. But we've been focusing on a lot of the automation architecture behind just like, for clinical trials, as you know, everything's done on Excel sheets and it's highly manual. Like, why don't we just optimize all of that? So front end protocol design, and then being able to optimize all the workflow and paperwork behind it. And then often even with pharma contract procurement on like these marketplaces that are matching pharmas with biotechs that have assets, and then just creating an interface to where they can liaison on that, and then automating all the paperwork when it comes to that. So that was a lot of stuff, but those are the buckets we've been hanging out and mapping. It's just like stuff that has, highly manual, repeatable stuff that AI can actually do correctly, and then couple that to the maximize enterprise value creation on the customer side. So
it's interesting. You touched on a pet topic of mine, which is CROs, right? And who actually runs trials. And I want to come back to like picking the smart assets in immunology, oncology, which by the way is an enormous challenge. Just like those are very crowded spaces for lots of obvious reasons. So knowing what's hot or not there is I think some magic in and of itself. Yep. But coming back to the CRO, one of the issues I've had with trying to bring technology into clinical development is the incumbent interest, right, in sustaining what's essentially a highly inefficient architecture because it's revenue generating. So if you look at the larger CROs and think about what they're doing and you try to bring some innovation, right, or efficiency to where it is, they often can't capture the value for that. It can actually be reduced value, right? They lose access to revenue. These are services that they provide. They make a margin on the service. So I've often thought that if you actually wanted to do this right, you would need to start all over again. You couldn't go into one of the legacy CROs. Do you see an emergence of AI-powered kind of clinical development and research organizations on their own? Or do you think, maybe I'm wrong, and these traditional players are actually going to embrace this innovation and try to drive it forward? How's that going to play?
Yeah, excellent question. And I think, it's funny. Yeah, those companies, LabCorp and, all those companies thrive off of inefficiency, right? And it's easier to bill for. And since you have eminent domain and own the market, you don't have to worry about another incumbent solution taking it over. And I think a lot of the biotech SaaS companies were trying to automate CRO workflows. And unfortunately, the thing is that the enterprise value multiples aren't there, right? And oftentimes the budgets aren't there to support that. So companies like in Silico Medicine did a really great job in just being like, you know what? Why don't I just build the closed loop labs in-house where I can just do the synthesis, GMP, all of that stuff, and do it in an ultra high throughput way where I don't have to deal with, oftentimes on the CRO stuff, they mess up all the time on the experimental protocols or whatever. And then we have to have another delay of 6 months. And then oftentimes the founder freaks out because they're like, oh, well, that might put me for a missed milestone on the clinical side because of this. And I think having the nexus of control, this new era of full stack tech bio companies where we can take all these indiscrete elements and just do it in house, and then do it in a way where the data feedback loop is closed loop and truly automated. Like, I think that's where automation gets maximized, because when people are trying to do automation, oftentimes I find that they get pigeonholed as a point solution. And like, I've seen a lot of, biotechs doing, automation plays, but like they never scale. Like, or if they do, like they'll hit a 50 million revenue run rate, but they'll only be valued at 200 million, because the public side markets are going to be like, well, CDMO, CRO multiples are going to be 5 to 7x. And then you're like, the investors are like, well, all the value is associated with the assets. So you have to buckle this into that workflow of that company. And that's where you maximize the enterprise value. So I think it's a logical stepwise progression that these companies would just do the closed loop labs in house and maximize the enterprise value for themselves, as opposed to, continuing to parlay in that. Because, Charles River and everything, the market caps are not that big. Like, right. And you'd be like, wow, they're making a boatload of money. Why is the multiple so low? So, and then all the folks, including myself, were like, oh, well, we have to peg this to an asset development, and this needs to just be in-house for the next set of biotechs. So
do you think there's going to be an aggregation or consolidation of these full stack? Is there like a new large pharma of the future, right? Which is, it's kind of like, I always think of the Hollywood model, right? Which is the big, studios used to do everything in-house themselves because it was better and more efficient. They could control the entire process. And then slowly it got fragmented and spread out until nothing happened in-house other than production, right? Raise the money and fund the production. And then everything else is like the long list of people you see on the credits. So it kind of felt to me like big pharma got pretty close to that stage, right? In terms of certainly of their like new product development. I think commercial has remained pretty closely held in those organizations. So they essentially acquire assets, complete the final development, do the market, adoption, HTA, whatever they need to do, and bring it to commercial valuation in the market. But do you think we're going to go back to seeing larger enterprises that are this kind of full stack solution? Is there a reinventing big pharma that takes place?
yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I worked with Eli Lilly on the robotic cloud automation stuff. And unfortunately, the thing we realize is that pharma wants to keep everything in-house. They don't want to send samples out. Everything, just because of the conflict of interest and having multiple arrangements with other pharma, you never know when information's going to get misspelled. And I think they all want to automate, the solutions in-house, but ideally, you would have to have a software solution that can integrate all the disparate laboratory equipment into one, workflow. I mean, it would be great that one scientist has the output of 100, right? So you can eliminate redundancies in that. But I think the way that pharma has approached automating laboratory architecture in-house, they all want to do it, but they don't actually understand how to do it, or could find somebody that could do it without adding another instrument to the workbench. And that's been the thing where I'm like, AI could be very good at that. But the problem is that the budgets won't support a solution that's going to cost more than a couple $1 million a year for that, depending on where the budget's being allocated. And then B, ideally you wouldn't have to have a lab tech trained on the UI, that it would just be kind of a lab manager would be able to get it. And then ideally, as the reproducibility crisis in biology is massive, right? Like none of these experiments get reproduced in a sustainable fashion at all. It's horrible. And you'd think going back to that inefficiency thing, you think they'd want to optimize for that to reduce the sunk costs of R&D for that asset development. And it's kind of the jury's still out on that. I'm curious to see, I would love to see, true end-to-end robotic automation. But as you know, robots are expensive and they become obsolete pretty quickly, and trying to figure out how you can take a software enabled approach to this, but that's very complex as well. But pharma like Daiichi and Takeda and all of them do want to do this. They just haven't found the correct way to do it.
So one last thing then, going back to the picking the right assets. So picking the right drugs, wickedly difficult problem, right? Because if you get it right, and you get it right even a little bit more often than everyone else, you make billions, right? If you get it right as much as everyone else, maybe you'll do okay. And if you miss a couple, you're dead, right? So how do you, when you talk earlier about oncology and immunology, right? Very crowded, complex spaces. What's the secret sauce to making the right picks?
Yeah, I think this is where, the cadence with pharma is super important. And I think like if you talk to investors, like I am a grocery list investor where I will talk to healthcare and pharma folks and then ask them, what do you actually want? And then I will make my list and go shopping for those companies. What's nice is that I'm systematically de-risking the go-to-market because I already know that what we're going to come out with is something that's of interest, but most importantly, it's of interest to multiple KOLs in that space, right? And this is super important because, a lot of the founders, like, they forget that you need to have a backup for your backup for your backup KOL in Merck and Pfizer in all of those companies, right? Because inevitably one of them's going to leave or and then you lose that advocacy and then you have to go back to find somebody else and it takes another 16 months to get that advocate up to speed for that program and everything. So typically the way I'll do it is like, if I don't have 4 to 5 KOLs in that major institution that all say the same thing to me in 2 years from now, when you come up with this DC, that this is the area, like that's just telling me like, if one of them's like, oh, I think this area is cool, like cardiac or whatever, I'll be like, okay. But if I'm not getting a general consensus from multiple people, that's telling me like, this is going to be a crapshoot and I don't want to be in that perspective. And most importantly, like when we're going over the P&L and everything for these companies, I want to make sure that when we do that Christmas list of clinical indication selection, A, the founder is excited about it, right? Because you don't want to be pushing through an asset you don't care about. B, like, I'm all like, okay, if you don't care about those assets, how do we figure out a narrative of how to out-license this to pharma so that you can get it off the books and then you can focus on the stuff you're excited about? And then how does that align to enterprise value on the investor side, right? Like, okay, like, if we find that pharma is excited about these orphan indications, how do I make sure that there's stratified risk of the other 2 programs in areas that pharma is actually interested in? And it's like, when you look at all those variables, it's like alphabet soup on trying to figure out how to get this correctly, because I like what's called cluster asset formation, right? I don't like to have a phase 2 program and then everything's at in vitro, because then you're setting yourself up for, inevitably there's going to be a bad readout. Like whether it's on preclinical side or clinical side, like it's going to come. And I think a lot of investors do freak out after the initial misread, because then they're like, well, we're done. Like we don't have enough backup. So if you can get, 1 clinical stage asset with 2 backup GLP tox IND programmed, that's letting me know at least we've got 3 shots on goal here, where there's no, probabilistically, we're not going to pick 3 indications that nobody cares about. And that kind of spreads the risk. But on some of the companies that are just doing the single asset thing, like that's already all of the risk already, let alone the clinical readouts. And that's where like having that expertise on the management team to understand like, hey, I've been in pharma for 20 years. I know the market read on this and I can dictate, even if we're just leading 1 asset forward, that I have the highest degree of certainty that this will be applicable. Like, that's where that Sherpa and founder element comes into play. Because otherwise, if you're just an AI person, you're never going to understand the intricacies of this, right? So, it's a question for the ages, but I think that playbook is getting iteratively refined these days, because as you know, pharma only cares about DCs or IND or clinic or late stage clinic these days. And if you don't have any of those, they won't even bother, so.
Well, thank you, Chris. You're a Sherpa to us all. Super excited. So, hey, thank you very much for coming to the show. It was wonderful to have you. I learned a ton. And thanks again for your participation in AI and healthcare. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Anytime, Mika.